14 women huddle in the ruins of a Philippine hospital, each gripping a final escape. Not a weapon, not a prayer, a cyanide capsule. Outside, American voices draw closer. Inside, 27-year-old nurse Yuki Nakamura whispers the words drilled into her since training. Death is lighter than a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. She knows what comes next. The propaganda promised torture, violation, execution. What she doesn't know is that everything she's been taught is about to shatter with a single, impossible gesture. October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf has just concluded as one of the largest naval engagements in human history. American forces sweep across the Philippine Islands, overwhelming Japanese defensive positions. In a makeshift hospital near the coast, these 14 military women, nurses, radio operators, medical assistants, face their final moments as free people. More accurately, they believe they face their final moments alive. Yuki Nakamura graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Nursing School in 1942. She volunteered, like thousands of other young women, driven by duty and national pride. The training was rigorous. Medical skills, yes, but also ideological preparation. Instructors showed propaganda films depicting American soldiers as inhuman beasts. Officers read testimonies fabricated or exaggerated of atrocities committed against Japanese prisoners. The message was clear and repeated. Capture meant a fate worse than death. The numbers tell a stark story. Approximately 25,000 Japanese women served in various military capacities during World War II. Of those, fewer than 200 were ever taken prisoner by Allied forces. The rest either died in combat, committed suicide, or successfully evacuated. The survival rate for captured Japanese military women was extraordinarily low, not because of enemy action, but because of their own choice. They had been taught that honor demanded self-destruction over surrender. This indoctrination wasn't limited to military personnel. On Saipan in 1944, as American forces secured the island, thousands of Japanese civilians threw themselves from cliffs rather than face capture. Mothers clutched their children as they jumped. Families detonated grenades in cave hideouts. At Marpy Point, the cliffs became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, memorializing one of the war's most tragic manifestations of propaganda's power. Similar scenes would repeat at Okinawa in 1945, where civilian deaths reached catastrophic levels partly due to Japanese military authorities convincing the population that Americans would torture and kill them. The propaganda had deep roots. Japanese media portrayed Americans as racial inferiors driven by base instincts. Posters showed American soldiers with demonic features, fangs, and claws. Radio broadcasts described invented atrocities. School children learned that Western forces represented barbarism against Japanese civilization. For military women like Yuki, this messaging was even more explicit and terrifying. They were told American soldiers would rape them repeatedly before killing them slowly. Surrender meant not just death, but degradation beyond imagination. So Yuki holds her capsule. Around her, 13 other women make similar preparations. Some pray, some weep silently. Some have already written final letters to families, though whether those letters will ever be delivered is uncertain. The hospital has been bombed. The structure partially collapsed. They have no weapons, no escape route, no options. The sound of boots on rubble grows louder. Then the door opens. American soldiers enter with rifles, but the rifles are lowered. No one is shooting. No one is screaming. The soldiers look young, tired, wary. They scan the room, count the women, speak into radios. The women press against the far wall, waiting for violence that doesn't come. Then something impossible happens. A man in American uniform steps forward and speaks in perfect Japanese. "You are safe now. You will not be harmed. You will receive food, water, and medical treatment." The voice belongs to Sergeant Robert Yoshida, a 38-year-old Nisei interpreter attached to the Military Intelligence Service. Yoshida was born in California in 1906 to Japanese immigrant parents. He grew up speaking both English and Japanese, navigating two cultures, two identities. When war came, his family faced suspicion and discrimination, yet he volunteered to serve as an interpreter. Approximately 6,000 Nisei like Yoshida served in military intelligence during the war. providing critical translation and cultural expertise. Many had family members imprisoned in internment camps, while they themselves wore American uniforms and risked their lives. For Yuki, the sight of Yoshida is profoundly disorienting. A Japanese face speaking her language, but wearing the enemy uniform. This wasn't part of the propaganda narrative. How could a Japanese person fight for America? How could someone who looked like her brother or cousin be part of the forces she'd been taught to fear and hate? The women don't believe Yoshida's words. Several assume it's a cruel trick, a way to lower their guard before the real torture begins. Others think perhaps the Americans will use them for propaganda purposes before executing them. The cyanide capsules remain gripped in sweaty palms. The Americans begin a processing routine that has become standard by this point in the war. They search for weapons, finding none. They check for injuries, noting several women have shrapnel wounds, burns, and signs of malnutrition. They radio for medical personnel and supplies. Throughout this process, Yoshida translates, his voice calm and professional. He explains what's happening, what will happen next, why they're being moved to a different location. The women are transported to a makeshift prisoner of war facility, established according to Geneva Convention protocols. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, which established international standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. Japan had signed but not ratified the convention, and Japanese treatment of Allied POWs was notoriously brutal, with death rates exceeding 27%. But American military policy mandated adherence to Geneva standards regardless of whether enemy forces reciprocated. The women are assigned to a separate barracks from male prisoners. They're given space, privacy, and time to process what's happening. They're told that in the morning they'll receive food and medical attention. Then the guards leave them alone, posting only external security. That night, none of them sleep. They debate in whispers whether to use the suicide capsules now, or wait to see what morning brings. Some argue that waiting only prolongs the inevitable torture. Others suggest that perhaps, impossibly, the Americans might actually follow the promises Yoshida made. Yuki says little, but she doesn't swallow her capsule. Something in Yoshida's eyes had seemed genuine. Something in the soldier's behavior had lacked the cruelty she'd expected. She decides to wait. Morning comes on October 25, 1944. Guards arrive carrying metal trays. On each tray, scrambled eggs still steaming, slices of white bread with butter, tin cups of coffee, and small portions of canned fruit. The women stare. Several refuse to touch the food, convinced it's poisoned. Yoshida returns and, seeing their hesitation, takes a portion from the communal pot and eats it himself. He pours coffee from the same urn and drinks. "It's not poisoned," he says. "It's breakfast." Army regulation requires 2,500 calories per day for prisoners of war. You'll receive 3 meals daily. The Army regulation Yoshida mentions was real. U.S. military policy dictated that POWs receive nutritionally adequate food comparable to what American troops consumed. Records from POW camps show menus, calorie counts, and nutrition standards that were monitored and enforced. This wasn't altruism alone. Healthy prisoners were easier to manage, provided better intelligence, and served American strategic interests. But the practical effect was that Japanese POWs often ate better in American captivity than they had in the final months of the war when Japanese supply lines had collapsed. Yuki slowly picks up a piece of bread. She smells it, examining for any sign of poison or contamination. Finding none, she takes a small bite. The taste is strange. American bread is sweeter than what she's used to, but it's real food. She eats slowly, watching for any ill effects. Around her, other women begin to eat as well, some still crying, some silent with shock. This breakfast becomes the first crack in the propaganda wall. Why would the Americans feed them before killing them? Why waste food on prisoners they plan to torture? The logic of the propaganda begins to unravel against the reality of eggs and coffee. After breakfast, Lieutenant Dorothy Reynolds arrives. Reynolds is 32, a veteran of Guadalcanal, and an officer in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. More than 59,000 American women served as military nurses during World War II, working in combat zones, field hospitals, and evacuation units. They faced danger, disease, and the overwhelming trauma of wartime medicine. Reynolds had seen the worst of the Pacific Theater, treating American casualties from some of the war's bloodiest battles. Now she's treating enemy prisoners. She carries a medical kit and, through Yoshida's translation, asks the women about their injuries. Yuki has a shrapnel wound on her left arm that's become infected. Reynolds examines it, her touch professional and gentle. She cleans the wound with antiseptic, applies sulfa powder to fight infection, and injects penicillin. Penicillin, the revolutionary antibiotic that had only become widely available in 1943, was being administered to an enemy prisoner. Historical records confirm that American military medical personnel treated POW injuries with the same standards and medications used for U.S. troops. This policy extended to serious procedures, surgeries, blood transfusions, even amputations when necessary. The medical corps operated under the principle that wounded prisoners were patients first, enemies second. For Yuki, this moment is transformative. She watches Reynolds work, sees the concentration on the American nurse's face, feels the careful ministration of her hands. This is not the behavior of a demon. This is not torture. This is medical care, administered with competence and something that looks almost like compassion. When Reynolds finishes, she smiles slightly and says through Yoshida, "Keep it clean. I'll check it again tomorrow." Over the following days, a routine establishes itself. 3 meals arrive daily. Medical checks continue. The women are given clean clothes, not military uniforms, but simple civilian-style garments. They have access to washing facilities, latrines, and a small outdoor area for exercise. Guards maintain professional distance. No one threatens them. No one harms them. But the psychological adjustment is agonizing. These women had spent months or years preparing for martyrdom. They had internalized the belief that their lives would end in sacrifice for the emperor and the nation. They had accepted that death was the only honorable outcome. Now they face the possibility of survival, and survival brings crushing questions. If they live, are they dishonored? If the Americans aren't monsters, what does that mean about everything they were taught? If the propaganda lied about the enemy, what else was a lie? Yoshida becomes a crucial figure in this psychological navigation. He speaks with the women regularly, answering questions, explaining American procedures, and simply being present as a bridge between worlds. His own story fascinates and disturbs them. He tells them about growing up in California, about Japanese immigrant communities, about his family's farm. He describes how, when war came, his family faced hostility from neighbors who suddenly saw them as enemies, despite decades of American residence. The internment of Japanese Americans is a dark chapter that Yoshida mentions with carefully controlled emotion. Executive Order 9066, signed in February 1942, authorized the forced relocation of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast to internment camps. 2/3 were American citizens. They lost homes, businesses, and livelihoods. They were imprisoned without trial, without charges, solely because of their ethnicity. Yoshida's own parents spent the war at the Manzanar internment camp in California, while their son served in the Pacific. He explains this to Yuki during one of their conversations, and she struggles to comprehend it. "Your government imprisoned your family, and you still serve them?" she asks. Yoshida's answer is measured. "I serve the principles America claims to represent, even when it fails to live up to those principles. Democracy, freedom, justice, they're worth fighting for, even when they're imperfectly practiced. And I fight against what Japan has become, a military dictatorship that has brought suffering to millions." This conversation is representative of documented interactions between Nisei interpreters and Japanese POWs. Many prisoners found the Nisei deeply confusing, challenging their understanding of ethnic loyalty and national identity. The propaganda had taught that blood loyalty was absolute, that Japanese people inherently belonged to Japan. The existence of Japanese Americans who identified as American, who fought against Japan, contradicted this fundamental belief. As weeks pass, more cracks appear in the indoctrination. Red Cross representatives visit the camp, documenting conditions and recording names for notification to the Japanese government through neutral channels. The International Committee of the Red Cross operated throughout the war to monitor POW treatment and facilitate communication. Their reports, preserved in archives, show inspections of American POW facilities and generally positive assessments of conditions. The Red Cross visit proves to the women that their treatment isn't just temporary theater. International observers are witnessing their care. They're being treated according to established standards, not subjected to propaganda-promised horrors. The women are also allowed to write letters home, though the letters are censored for military information. Yuki writes to her younger sister in Hiroshima. She carefully crafts her words, knowing censors will read them, but trying to communicate essential truth. "I am alive and unharmed," she writes. "The treatment here is fair. Do not believe everything you have been told about the enemy." She doesn't know this letter will never arrive. Hiroshima's fate lies 9 months in the future, and her sister will be among the victims of the atomic bombing in August 1945. But in October 1944, Yuki writes with a small, growing hope that truth can counter propaganda. Dorothy Reynolds checks Yuki's wound daily. As it heals, a different kind of relationship develops. They can't speak directly, language remains a barrier, but gestures, expressions, and Yoshida's translations create communication. Reynolds shares photographs of her family in Michigan. Yuki sketches pictures of her home in rural Japan. They discover common ground in medicine, discussing nursing techniques and patient care through translation. One day, Reynolds brings origami paper she acquired somehow. She doesn't know how to fold it, so Yuki teaches her. Together they create paper cranes, traditional symbols of hope and healing. This small act of cultural exchange, two enemy nurses creating art together, symbolizes the transformation happening in the camp. The POW facility expands as more Japanese prisoners are captured. Male soldiers are housed separately, but the same standards apply. Prisoners receive work assignments, though the work is voluntary and compensated with camp scrip that can be used to purchase small luxuries like cigarettes or toiletries. This, too, aligns with Geneva Convention requirements that POW labor be voluntary and compensated. Some prisoners resist adaptation. They cling to imperial ideology, insisting that death would have been preferable to the shame of survival. They treat those who accept American kindness as traitors. This creates tension within the prisoner population, a split between those willing to acknowledge reality and those who cannot reconcile it with their beliefs. Yuki finds herself in the former camp. She volunteers to work in the camp hospital, assisting with other prisoners' medical care. She works alongside Dorothy Reynolds and other American medical staff. She learns basic English medical terms. She begins to see Americans not as a faceless enemy, but as individuals, some kind, some indifferent, some competent, some not. They're humans, complex and varied, not the propaganda caricatures. As 1944 turns to 1945, the camp observes holidays from both cultures. Americans celebrate Christmas with decorations and special meals. The prisoners are not forced to participate, but they're not excluded either. Extra rations are distributed. Guards are relaxed. Yoshida explains the holiday's significance, the cultural traditions, the emphasis on peace and goodwill. When Japanese New Year approaches, something remarkable happens. Camp authorities permit the prisoners to observe shogatsu, the traditional New Year celebration central to Japanese culture. The women create decorations from available materials. They prepare what traditional foods they can manage with available ingredients. American guards watch curiously but respectfully. Dorothy Reynolds brings additional rice and allows the women extra time for preparations. On New Year's Day 1945, the women perform traditional rituals, offer prayers, and share modest celebratory food. It's a pale shadow of proper shogatsu celebrations, but it's something. Yoshida participates, connecting with cultural roots he's maintained despite his American identity. And when he raises a cup of tea in traditional greeting, several American staff members, including Reynolds, join in the toast despite not fully understanding its significance. This moment crystallizes Yuki's transformation. She realizes these Americans have permitted her to maintain cultural identity, even in captivity. They've respected traditions, allowed religious observance, and treated her not as a subhuman enemy, but as a person worthy of dignity. The propaganda had promised degradation. Reality delivers unexpected humanity. But then comes August 1945. News reaches the camp in fragments, delayed and censored. Something catastrophic has happened to Hiroshima. Initial reports are unclear, speaking of a new type of bomb. Unprecedented destruction. Casualties in the tens of thousands. Yuki's family lives in Hiroshima. Her sister, her elderly parents, her childhood home. She demands information from Yoshida, who has only slightly better access to news than the prisoners. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 people immediately, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation and injuries in the following months. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered similar devastation. These weapons, the culmination of the Manhattan Project, brought the war to an abrupt conclusion but at a human cost that still generates moral debate decades later. For Yuki and other prisoners from Hiroshima or Nagasaki, the news brings agony. They're alive in relative safety while their families may be dead or suffering. Survivors' guilt mixes with grief and horror. Some prisoners blame America entirely. Others recognize the complexity, that Japan's militarism had led to this point, that the war's continuation would have caused even more deaths, that blame is complicated and shared. Dorothy Reynolds finds Yuki sitting alone, weeping silently. Without Yoshida to translate, Reynolds can't offer words. Instead, she sits beside Yuki and simply stays present. She places a hand on Yuki's shoulder. She offers a handkerchief. 2 nurses, 2 enemies, 2 humans sharing grief for the horrors of war. Japan surrenders on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had heard his voice, announces the acceptance of Allied terms. The surrender is formal aboard USS Missouri on September 2nd. The war that had killed millions across Asia and the Pacific is finally over. For the POWs, surrender brings strange limbo. They're no longer prisoners of an ongoing war, but they can't immediately return home. Repatriation processes take months to organize. Japan is occupied, its infrastructure devastated, its society in chaos. Who will they return to? What Japan will they find? Yuki learns through Red Cross channels that her sister died in Hiroshima. Her parents survived but are ill from radiation exposure. Her childhood home was incinerated. The life she knew is gone. The prospect of return brings not relief, but dread. She'll go back to a destroyed country, a devastated family, and a society that will view her survival as POW with shame and suspicion. This stigma was real and documented. Japanese POWs faced severe social prejudice upon return. In a culture that had emphasized death before dishonor, those who survived captivity were seen as having failed their duty. Many struggled to find employment, marry, or reintegrate into society. Some never spoke publicly about their POW experiences, carrying the shame in silence for the rest of their lives. Camp authorities begin preparing prisoners for repatriation in early 1946. They provide clothing, basic funds, medical clearances, and documentation. Dorothy Reynolds conducts final medical examinations, ensuring everyone is as healthy as possible for the journey. She examines Yuki's arm where the shrapnel wound had been. It's healed completely, leaving only a small scar. "You can barely see it," Reynolds says through Yoshida. Yuki looks at the scar and thinks about everything it represents. A wound inflicted by war, healed by an enemy, carried forward as reminder of lessons learned. Before departure, Yuki and Reynolds exchange addresses. They know correspondence will be difficult, possibly censored, maybe impossible, but they exchange information anyway, a gesture of hope that connection might endure. Yoshida facilitates writing addresses in both English and Japanese. Yuki's final conversation with Yoshida is longer. She thanks him for his patience, his translations, his bridge between worlds. She asks what he'll do now that the war is over. He plans to stay in the army for a while, helping with occupation and reconstruction efforts in Japan. He has skills that are needed. Eventually, he hopes to return to California, help his family rebuild their lives after internment. "What will you tell people about your experience here?" he asks her. Yuki considers carefully. "I don't know if I'll tell anyone. They won't believe me. Or worse, they'll condemn me for it. But I'll remember. I'll remember that what we were taught was wrong. I'll remember that the enemy showed humanity we were told they lacked. Maybe someday that will matter." Repatriation ships carry Japanese POWs home in early 1946. The journey is long, uncomfortable, and fraught with anxiety about what awaits. Yuki stands on deck as the ship approaches Japan, seeing her homeland after nearly 2 years. The coastline shows war damage, bombed facilities, destroyed docks, evidence of devastation. This is not the Japan she left. This is a defeated nation, occupied by the forces she once fought against, transformed by catastrophic loss. She returns to her family's region, finding her parents living in temporary housing. They're gaunt, sick from radiation effects that will eventually kill them. They embrace her with joy and relief, but neighbors view her with suspicion. The daughter who went to war and survived captivity. What did she do to stay alive? What did she betray? Yuki doesn't speak about her treatment in American custody. She doesn't describe the breakfast, the medical care, the respect for New Year traditions. She certainly doesn't mention the friendship with Dorothy Reynolds. To speak of these things would invite accusations of collaboration, of disloyalty, of dishonor. So she stays silent, as many POWs did, carrying truth as private burden. But silence doesn't mean inaction. Yuki dedicates herself to work with war orphans, children who lost families in the bombings or battles. She works in orphanages and relief organizations. She teaches children basic medical care, sanitation, and health. And in subtle ways, she teaches them something else: that enemies can be human, that hate is learned, not inherent, that compassion matters more than vengeance. She never explicitly references her POW experience, but it shapes everything she does. When children speak with hatred about Americans, she gently redirects toward healing. When they express desire for revenge, she emphasizes building a better future. Her co-workers notice her unusual perspective, but don't press for explanations. Post-war Japan has too much trauma, too much grief, too many people carrying unspeakable experiences. The letters with Dorothy Reynolds do eventually flow, though sporadically. Reynolds returns to Michigan, resumes civilian nursing, eventually marries and has children. Her letters describe normal American life, the mundane details of peacetime existence. Yuki's letters describe reconstruction, recovery, and work with children. They don't discuss the war directly, but the connection endures. Decades pass, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Japan transforms from occupied nation to economic power. The war generation ages, carrying memories that younger generations can barely comprehend. Some veterans never speak about their experiences. Others gradually, carefully, begin to share testimonies. In 1987, a Japanese documentary filmmaker conducting interviews with POW survivors reaches out to Yuki. She's 70 years old now, her parents long dead, her own children grown. She has less to lose from speaking truth. After careful consideration, she agrees to a recorded interview. The filmmaker asks about her capture, her expectations, her experience in American custody. Yuki speaks slowly, choosing words with care. She describes the terror of waiting for execution, the incomprehension of breakfast being served, the gentle hands of an American nurse treating her wound, the permission to celebrate New Year, the complexity of learning that everything she'd been taught was propaganda. "What changed for you?" the filmmaker asks. Yuki is quiet for a long moment. Then she says, "I carried a cyanide capsule. I was prepared to die rather than face what I'd been told would happen. But what happened instead was, they treated me like a human being. Not a Japanese, not an enemy, but a person. They fed me. They healed my injuries. They respected my traditions. That simple humanity was more powerful than any weapon, because it destroyed the propaganda completely. You can't maintain hate when the enemy shows you kindness. Do you think that kindness was strategic?" the interviewer probes. "A way to gather intelligence or undermine morale?" "Perhaps partly," Yuki acknowledges. "But I also think it reflected something real about American values, or at least the values they aspired to. They had signed treaties about prisoner treatment and they followed them, even when Japan had not. That moral consistency mattered. It gave them genuine authority, not just military power." The interview continues, covering her return to Japan, the stigma of survival, her decades of work with children. At the end, the filmmaker asks if she has any regrets. "Many," Yuki says. "I regret that I ever believed the propaganda. I regret that I needed to be captured to learn truth. I regret that so many people died on both sides because leaders chose war over peace. But I don't regret surviving. I don't regret learning that people are more complex than propaganda allows. I don't regret spending my life trying to teach children what I learned too late, that hate is a choice, and we can choose differently." This interview shows real testimonies from Japanese POWs who eventually spoke about their experiences. Archives contain recordings, transcripts, and written accounts from survivors who described the psychological shock of humane treatment after expecting atrocity. These testimonies are historically valuable, providing Japanese perspectives on American POW policies and revealing the profound effects of propaganda on individual psychology. The statistical record supports Yuki's experience as representative rather than exceptional. Of approximately 5,000 Japanese military personnel captured by American forces during World War II, death rates in custody were less than 1%. This contrasts starkly with the approximately 27% mortality rate for Allied POWs in Japanese custody. The difference reflects systematic policy choices about prisoner treatment, choices rooted in legal frameworks, strategic calculations, and cultural values about warfare and human dignity. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established international standards that most Allied nations followed, with varying degrees of success and consistency. The United States generally adhered to these standards, seeing benefit in moral high ground, intelligence gathering from well-treated prisoners, and post-war relationship building. This doesn't erase other American wartime failures. The internment of Japanese Americans stands as significant moral stain. But in the specific realm of military POW treatment, American adherence to international law created outcomes like Yuki's survival. The breakfast that Yuki couldn't believe, scrambled eggs, bread, coffee, was more than food. It was a message, intentional or not, about civilization's demands. It said that even in total war, some standards persist, that enemies remain human, that victory doesn't require vengeance, that power includes the capacity for restraint. For 14 women in a Philippine hospital in October 1944, that breakfast saved lives the propaganda had already condemned. It created possibility where doctrine had promised only death. It planted seeds of truth that would eventually undermine the militarism that had dragged Japan through years of devastating war. Yuki Nakamura lived to age 93, dying peacefully in 2010. Among her possessions, her daughter found letters from Dorothy Reynolds spanning decades, photographs from the POW camp, and a small glass vial that had once contained cyanide, now empty but preserved. Also found was a diary, written in private over many years, documenting her POW experience in detail she'd never shared publicly. The daughter donated these materials to a historical archive dedicated to preserving war testimonies. Researchers studying Pacific War experiences, POW treatment, and propaganda effects now have access to Yuki's first-person account. It joins thousands of other testimonies, from all sides, all nations, all perspectives, that collectively paint the complex, painful human reality of history's largest conflict. The title of this story asks us to consider three negatives: no execution, no rifles, no fear. In their absence, something else became possible. Not friendship exactly. The context was too fraught, the power imbalance too real, but something closer to recognition. An acknowledgement across battle lines that the person opposite you, enemy though they may be, shares fundamental humanity. That recognition didn't end the war. It didn't undo the millions of deaths, the atomic bombings, the devastation across Asia and the Pacific. It didn't erase American sins like internment or Japanese atrocities like Nanjing. War remained war, with all its horror and waste and tragedy. But for 14 women who expected to die, that recognition meant survival. It meant returning home, rebuilding lives, teaching children, planting gardens, growing old. It meant carrying forward a lesson about propaganda's lies and humanity's possibilities. It meant that one small corner of a vast war was conducted according to principles that honored human dignity over dehumanizing hate. The breakfast served to enemy prisoners in a Philippine POW camp wasn't heroic. It was simply lawful, decent, and humane. That it seemed impossible to those prisoners reveals how deeply propaganda had poisoned minds on all sides. That it happened anyway reveals that some standards, some values, some basic recognition of shared humanity can persist even in war's darkest hours. Yuki's story is one story among millions from World War II. It's not more important than others. It doesn't erase other narratives of suffering, heroism, tragedy, or moral failure, but it offers a specific documented example of how treating enemies with basic human decency served everyone better than the alternative. The Americans gained intelligence, undermined enemy morale, and built foundation for post-war reconciliation. The prisoners gained survival, truth, and eventual reintegration into peacetime life. Most importantly, Yuki's story demonstrates propaganda's ultimate weakness. Lies, no matter how often repeated or how deeply internalized, crumble against lived reality. The Japanese government had told her Americans were demons. One breakfast, one medical treatment, one respectful conversation proved otherwise. That single crack in the propaganda wall eventually widened to transform her entire worldview. She spent the rest of her life teaching children, not explicitly about her POW experience, but about the values that experience had taught her. Compassion over hate, truth over propaganda, humanity over ideology. These lessons, passed to children who grew up in a different Japan, contributed in small but real ways to the transformation of a militaristic empire into a peaceful democracy. The cyanide capsule Yuki never swallowed became, in her private symbolism, a reminder of the death she didn't die, and the life she chose instead. The choice wasn't entirely hers. American soldiers prevented the suicide Japanese doctrine demanded, but having survived against expectation, she made conscious choices about how to live with that survival. She chose purpose over shame, work over withdrawal, teaching over silence. These choices didn't erase the stigma Japanese society imposed on POW survivors, but they gave her life meaning despite that stigma. They transformed survival from dishonor into opportunity for good. When Dorothy Reynolds died in 1998, her family contacted Yuki to inform her. Despite old age and distance, Yuki traveled to Michigan for the memorial service. It was her first visit to America, more than 50 years after the war's end. Reynolds's children welcomed her, having heard stories throughout their lives about the Japanese nurse their mother had treated and befriended. At the service, Yuki spoke briefly, her English heavily accented but clear. She described Reynolds as someone who embodied the best of humanity in the worst of times, someone who saw patients before enemies, people before propaganda, someone whose simple acts of medical care and cultural respect had transformed a terrified prisoner into a survivor with purpose. "Your mother saved my life twice," Yuki told Reynolds's family. "Once by treating my wound and once by treating me with dignity. The first saved my body, the second saved my soul. I am grateful beyond words." This moment, a former Japanese military prisoner honoring a former American military nurse at a memorial service in Michigan, encapsulates the unlikely connections war sometimes creates. These two women had been on opposite sides of history's deadliest conflict. Ideology, propaganda, and military orders said they should be mortal enemies. Yet basic humanity, manifested through acts of care and kindness, created a bond that transcended national boundaries and lasted lifetimes. The story of Yuki Nakamura and the 14 Japanese military women captured in the Philippines is ultimately about the power of lived truth over taught lies. It's about how simple decency, feeding prisoners, treating wounds, respecting traditions, can undermine even the most pervasive propaganda. It's about choices made at every level, from policymakers crafting POW treatment guidelines to individual soldiers and nurses implementing those policies with humanity and respect. It reminds us that even in war, even between enemies, even when victory seems to permit vengeance, treating others with basic human dignity serves everyone's interests better than brutality. The breakfast that Japanese POWs couldn't believe possible became proof that their enemies were human, that their propaganda was false, and that a different future was imaginable. That future arrived, slowly and imperfectly. Japan and America transformed from bitter enemies into close allies. Veterans from both sides eventually met in reconciliation ceremonies. Shared economic interests and democratic values created partnership. The war's hatreds gradually, painfully, gave way to cooperation. This transformation didn't happen automatically or inevitably. It required conscious choices by leaders and citizens on both sides to move beyond vengeance toward cooperation. But those choices were made easier because even during the war's worst moments, some people on both sides had maintained basic humanity toward their enemies. Every prisoner fed, every wound treated, every tradition respected, created a tiny foundation for future peace. These acts didn't seem significant at the time. They were simply following regulations, doing jobs, adhering to international law. But cumulatively, they mattered. They proved that even enemies can act with honor, that even in war some lines need not be crossed, that victory achieved through honorable means creates better peace than victory achieved through atrocity. Yuki's breakfast, scrambled eggs, bread, coffee, canned fruit, was just food. But to a woman expecting execution, it was revelation. It was the first moment in a long journey from fear through understanding to wisdom. It was proof that everything she'd been taught was wrong, and that truth, however uncomfortable, was better than comfortable lies. She carried that lesson forward through decades of post-war life, through work with orphans, through quiet teaching, through preservation of memory. And now her story, like thousands of others from that terrible war, stands as testimony and warning. Testimony to human resilience and decency even in the darkest times. Warning about propaganda's power and the necessity of maintaining humanity, even toward enemies. The rifles that weren't aimed at 14 terrified women in October 1944 didn't fire. The executions promised by propaganda didn't happen. The fear instilled by years of indoctrination gradually dissipated against reality's stubborn truth. What remained was life, possibility, and lessons hard-learned about the difference between what we're taught to believe and what actually is. That difference matters. It mattered to Yuki Nakamura. It matters to understanding history. And it matters still, in every time and place where propaganda demands we view others as less than human, where hate is taught as virtue, where violence is presented as the only option. Against such teachings, simple acts of decency become revolutionary. A breakfast becomes a message. Survival becomes testimony. And one person's transformation becomes a lesson for all who follow. If Yuki's story moved you, if the power of truth over propaganda resonates, help us share these forgotten histories. Hit that subscribe button to join a community dedicated to uncovering the human stories behind the headlines. A like tells the algorithm that real history matters. And drop a comment below. What surprised you most about this story? Have you heard similar accounts from your own family's war experiences? Your engagement helps these testimonies reach others who need to hear them. Real history, real people, real lessons. Subscribe, like, and let's keep these conversations alive.